Hey everyone, God bless you, and I hope you're enjoying a joyful festal period of the great feast of the presentation of the Lord in the temple. My topic today is the meaning behind chronic and acute diseases. What does God intend, and how are we to understand the presence of especially chronic disease in our life? You know, I have a lot of fun with my parishioners by, over the years, developing certain comebacks to the common question that we ask each other, how are you? I've developed a whole kind of repertoire of comebacks. I've also tried to pass on a lesson that I learned when I was young, never to answer that question, how are you, with the dreaded word, good. But what I've been using recently comes from St. Paul's writings, and it's very apropos for the subjects that we've been covering in our last few reflections. It comes from St. Paul's second epistle to the Corinthians, where he describes the condition of his life with these words: hard pressed on every side. Hard pressed on every side. So I've been trying that lately. When someone asks me, how are you? I say, hard pressed on every side. It does convey something of the gravitas of Christian life and the fact that we are in the middle of spiritual war, all of us, every believer, and therefore, in some way, although it doesn't apply like it did to the immeasurably glorious life of the great Apostle Paul, in some way, every Christian can honestly say that we are hard-pressed on every side. And sometimes we particularly feel this way when we are hemmed in, so to speak, by illnesses. And it's about that just a little bit that I'd like to talk, because this year it has been for this last 12 months, a constant theme of thought in the lives of believers all over the world. The fact that we are hard-pressed on every side by this virus and by the ramifications of the virus and the social actions that have been taken in response to it. What is the meaning? What is the thought behind this? Again, I'm turning your attention to St. Basil the Great, and I want to remind you, as we have been discussing his beautiful words about approaching medicine in moderation, about embracing asceticism, not just the asceticism that is required for physical health and that we all seem to voluntarily embrace from our physicians, but also in the spiritual life. And in our last reflection, we focused on St. Basil's instructions about how to focus on curing our own spiritual diseases, identifying their origin, their nature, their manifestation, and how to cure them. Today, I'd like to specifically speak about chronic diseases and how we should react to chronic diseases in our life. You know, in the life of St. Basil the Great, as well as in the life of the other three holy hierarchs, St. John Chrysostom and St. Gregory the theologian, there looms a very influential character. Of course, Christ is supreme king in the lives of the three holy hierarchs. St. Paul also holds a unique place in their life, but also a man whose life just preceded theirs and about whom their family spoke, because the life of St. Anthony the Great, who died in 356 as a very old man, literally permeated Christian thinking and discussion as St. Basil, St. Gregory, and St. John Chrysostom were growing up in the middle of the 4th century. And St. Anthony was very clear. He commonly called his spiritual children, and through them, everyone who would hear and read about his life, especially through the incredible biography written of him by St. Athanasius the Great. St. Anthony would constantly say this: less attention to the body and more attention to the soul. He was constantly calling upon human beings to recognize that they are the union of a body and a soul. Of course, this principle is anathema to the secularists of our day. St. Anthony called us to recognize that a human being is the union of body and soul, and that the soul must receive supreme care, and the body according to its necessities. This is the teaching of St. Anthony the Great. And that thought deeply impacted the minds and the writings and teachings of the three holy hierarchs. And it certainly is evident in St. Basil the Great's words about how to treat physical and spiritual diseases, and how Christians should, in fact, relate to doctors and to medicines and to the whole process of therapeutic treatment. Acute and chronic diseases this is an easy schema that we can use to describe many of our physical illnesses. Sometimes we have just an acute illness that comes upon us, and then it leaves us. We may know what precipitated its appearance, or we may not. We also have, each of us, certain diseases that aren't going anywhere, certain diseases and debilitations of the body that require constant care and prolonged treatment. These are chronic diseases in comparison to acute diseases. And St. Basil the Great asks us to perceive through the appearance of chronic and acute diseases the reality that there are corresponding spiritual diseases of the same nature. So, for instance, we all have experienced acute spiritual disease when we commit a particular sin that just appears to come upon us, and just as quickly by repentance and the mercy of God disappears. We're weary and we lose our watchfulness, and so we say an impatient word to our spouse. And by owning that sin and asking for forgiveness for that sin and receiving it, we find ourselves cured, and that's that. This is the easy treatment of an acute disease. It's like a physical headache that comes on for a short time, and you drink some water, or perhaps you take a headache pill, or put some holy oil on your head, and it's gone. But we also, all of us, have chronic diseases that don't just go away. And it's very important in the spiritual life not to confuse the two. Many Christians fail to make spiritual progress simply because they confuse the difference between an acute and a chronic disease. And they make the mistake of thinking that all spiritual diseases are acute and can simply be dealt with by asking forgiveness or going to confession one time. That is not the case. That is not the case. Acute diseases can be cured by short treatment, but not chronic ones, not ones that have a deep root in habit or an inheritance or particular weaknesses of the soul. Those require a much more serious treatment, just like chronic diseases require extended treatment with regards to the body, constant watchfulness, the execution of a medical plan, regular visits to the physician, perhaps some surgery, perhaps therapy, etc., and a lot of sustained difficulty. So it is in our lives in the spiritual realm. I'd like to read you a text from St. Basil the Great on this very subject, on the meaning of chronic spiritual diseases. This is what he says. He says, the fact that chronic illnesses persist over a long period, and despite varied and painful remedies, is a sign. So here he's describing physical chronic diseases that, despite our efforts, continue, and they really harass us. He says this is a sign. This is a message from God through the disease to us. What is it a sign of? The fact that chronic illnesses persist over a long period and despite varied and painful remedies is a sign that we should amend the sins of the soul by assiduous prayer, prolonged repentance, and the severe disciplinary treatment which reason may advise as adequate for the cure. Do you hear his counsel, dear ones? St. Basil is saying that we should learn a lesson from the appearance of chronic diseases in our own body. And that is a lesson to approach our curing of the soul and our chronic spiritual diseases with prolonged repentance, with a deep and sustained spiritual effort, that will in fact lead to cure, not by just a quick confession, not just by a quick word, but instead, he even says severe disciplinary trials, very serious actions like extended fasting, like extended prayer. These are means by which we can address the larger spiritual diseases in our life. And don't forget, dear ones, don't forget that in the process of acknowledging and struggling against our illnesses of body and soul, we learn very much how not to rely upon ourselves, but to rely upon God. More on that in my last reflection, which will come soon, God being my helper. And we will, after that, lay aside our reflections from St. Basil on spiritual medicine. God be with you.
Patristic Nectar Publications is pleased to present a new 5-lecture series entitled Contemporary Women Saints. St. John of Sinai, in his Ladder of Divine Ascent, writes that the lives of the saints arouse us to emulation of their courage and lead us to the virtue of humility and compunction. Contemporary saints are particularly important since they acquired their love for God and holiness in the midst of our current milieu and demonstrate that spiritual acquisition is possible even in our own troubled times.
For these and other available titles, please visit our website at patristicnectar.org.